time.
Oh my gosh, I can't believe it. Like my daughter was with us in Africa for a week, but the whole time we left Connor in charge of the skydiving school,
Oh, wow, good.
and we've been kind of grooming him to take over the business at some point.
Yeah.
This is a good first throw him to the wolves and see how he does for a couple of weeks, and he did great.
Good for him.
Really came through.
So she sends her regards.
I'll tell Connor.
Yeah, good.
All right. How long would you like me to speak for?
Well, what do people? Well, you guys are
Typically,
half an hour.
Yeah, about that. Maybe a little bit longer, but not usually too bad.
37 minutes.
I see people, and a half.
32.3
And a half.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks for coming, everybody. My name is Kerry McCauley, and I am a ferry pilot. And I guess the first thing you guys all need to know is, because you're not a bunch of pilots who come here, my usual crowd, is what is a ferry pilot? A ferry pilot is somebody who moves airplanes for other people. My specialty is international ferry flying, specifically over ocean ferry flying. What I do is if someone buys a plane that's in Ohio and the plane is in Singapore, I'm the guy that flies it over, because if the new owner is not stupid enough to fly it over the North Atlantic himself, he needs to find someone stupid enough. I am stupid enough to fly small single-engine airplanes over the ocean. I got my start in aviation. Basically, I grew up in Coon Rapids, just north of Minneapolis. I got my start in aviation when I joined the Minnesota Army National Guard. I went to, at 17, in between my junior and senior year of high school, and I went to UH-1H Huey Crew Chief School. I was a Huey Crew Chief. I joined in 1979, which is how old I am.
You must know cruisers.
Oh, I know the cruiser very well. Yeah, we're in the same unit together. We bought property together.
Yep.
He's one of my best friends.
Yeah, he's a good man.
Yeah, he is.
Gotten crazy with him a little bit.
I wasn't flying though. I was a crew chief, basically the guy in the back of the helicopter. And one afternoon, one of my fellow crew chiefs showed up, and I hadn't seen him in a while. And I say, "Pete, where you been?" He says, I just got back from South Africa. I flew a small single-engine plane to South Africa. Tell me more about that, because that sounds cool. And he told me about the life of a ferry pilot, basically delivering small planes around the world. His father actually owned the company inside South St. Paul Airport. And in the second he started talking about it, I was hooked. That just sounded like the greatest adventure in the world. It sort of gives you, you mean to tell me they give you a cool airplane, a handful of cash, and tell you to fly to the other side of the planet? Sign me up. Unfortunately, I wasn't a pilot. I didn't have a license of any kind at that time. So I got to work, went to flight school at the Anoka County Airport, got all my licenses, started skydiving out at Osceola, Wisconsin, and then became a jump pilot to build time. They said they wanted the pilots to have about 1,500 hours before they'd let them fly small planes around the world. But when I was just over 1,000 hours, my buddy was getting married, and I saw his father at the wedding reception, good and drunk, and I went up and did a job interview on the spot and got talked him into hiring me. And in just 3 years since I first heard about being a ferry pilot, I wasn't, which was fantastic. I was through. So I figured, they're going to start me off slow, though. I couldn't wait to get started. I figured, well, they'll give me a small plane, and maybe we'll fly some to Iowa, maybe down to Texas or something like that. And a couple days later, my boss's wife called. She's the one who did the scheduling and said, "Are you ready for your first trip?" "You bet. Put me in, coach." "Where am I going?" "Lisbon, Portugal." Whoa, hang on. Never done anything like that before. I'm like, okay, cool. Well, that's not a big deal. Obviously I won't be going by myself. I'll be, somebody, I'm sure I'll be in the cockpit with an experienced ferry pilot so I can show me the ropes. I have no idea how to do that. So then I asked, "So who am I going with?" "Nope, you're going by yourself." Awesome. Completely solo in the airplane. Good deal. I wasn't going to be 100% by myself. My boss was going to be along in a separate airplane. He was flying a plane to Switzerland, and he would be with me in spirit all the way along, but our planes would be miles apart. And it wasn't like they were going to send me off across the ocean without any training. That's just crazy. Up until that point, the farthest over water, right, like Michigan. There's just a tiny little 5-minute window in there that you might not reach the shore for engine quits. So they did run me through Orient Air's, and that's the name of the company, Orient Air. Orient Air's rigorous ferry pilot training program, which consisted of me sitting in my boss's office for 3 hours drinking scotch with him while he told me all the different ways you could get killed flying small planes over the North Atlantic. It was very inspiring. So on that first day, first trip, going back to life, it's so small. The route we took was from St. Paul to Bangor, Maine, where we cleared customs, then St. John's, Newfoundland, which is the easternmost point of Canada. And from there, it was an 1,800-mile stretch down to Santa Maria in the Azores. The Azores being a couple of a cluster of islands down off the coast, 800 miles off the coast of Portugal. And let me tell you, when you're sitting on the ramp on the runway getting ready for that first crossing, it's kind of intimidating. You know, my boss told me that there've been a lot of pilots that they get to that point and they chicken out. They leave the keys in the plane, they park it, they catch an airliner home and say, I tried, but I just didn't have the guts. But I was in my early 20s, and as you know, young men in their early 20s are completely invincible and have not a lot of common sense. So no big deal. I took off, headed out over the ocean. And then I had the second kind of really big gut check there is when you look over your shoulder, you see the last little point of Canada disappear over the horizon. And then you look 360 as far as you can see, nothing but open ocean. Like, pretty sobering. But that first trip was amazing. It was so much fun, and it was so easy. I mean, it's a beautiful day, bright sunshine. The plane I was flying actually had 2 engines. It was a light trainer, 4-passenger twin. Engines were running great. The radios were fine. I had a big bag of snacks next to me and a case of Diet Mountain Dew, and I was just having a ball. And realized at that point I'd made the greatest decision of my life. This is easy money, and I knew I'd be doing it for the rest of my life. And that feeling lasted right up until the halfway point. And then stuff changed. It wasn't me that had a problem, though. It was my boss. He called me and said he'd lost his vacuum pump. Now, the vacuum pump in an airplane is the instrument that drives all the instruments that you use to fly in the clouds. Artificial horizon, turn and bank indicator, everything you need to fly in the clouds. Now, the airplanes do have backups, but they're very rudimentary. They're very difficult to use. When you get into that situation, it's an emergency situation, and the normal course of action is land as soon as possible. But when you're in the middle of the North Atlantic, land as soon as possible means 8 hours. So my boss was a little concerned because even though the first half of the trip was clear blue skies and beautiful bright sunshine, the second half of the trip was forecast to be low clouds, heavy rain, high winds, and nighttime. Because we were heading eastbound, so you're going against the time zone, so it gets dark very quickly. Plus, it was in between Christmas and New Year's, so very short days anyway, and it got dark really fast. So he was pretty nervous about it. Plus, at the time, he was pretty old. He was 60 years old then, and 61. He was in the prime of his life, and but he hadn't practiced that emergency procedure in a while, kind of like I haven't really either. So he was understandably concerned about the rest of that evening. So he had an idea. We were about 50 minutes apart. In Canada, they make you take off 50 minutes in between us so we don't go run into each other. And he was going to circle in place and let me catch up. And as I caught up to him, he was going to form up on my wing, and we were going to do night IFR in the rain formation flying to our destination in the Azores. Great. Sounds like a plan. Sign me up. It sounds incredibly dangerous, but heck with that. Like I said, 20 years old, no common sense, invincible. So that's what we did. I found him. He circled over the first island in the Azores chain of this volcanic cone. That was the last thing just before we could see the clouds on the horizon we had to fly into. He formed up on me, and we plunged into the clouds right as the sun set. And then it really got interesting because I kept looking over my shoulder, and airplanes have position lights on the wings, and you can see those lights coming closer and back and up and down. If you'd ever been a good formation pilot, he was a little out of practice that night. And I was pretty scared. Man, crick him, man, I'm looking at him. But I kind of have to thank him for that because I was way more scared of him crashing into me than I was about what I was really doing, which is still flying a small airplane over the huge Atlantic Ocean at night in a storm, trying to find a tiny island in the middle of this. And I have to find that island because there's no gas to go anywhere else. I don't have enough gas to get to Africa or Europe, so have to find that. Plus, this was in 1990.
No GPS.
No GPS. I have my first 8 crossings were exactly like Charles Lindbergh, nothing but a compass and a map. And once you take off, you just have that compass to follow, and if you're off course, too bad for you. Now, the islands that we have do have a beacon there. There's a navigation beacon. It's rudimentary, basically. It's called a non-directional beacon, and you've got a little receiver in your instrument panel that just basically has a needle that kind of points toward it. But you have to be close enough to that island to pick it up. So if you're off course, you're not going to find it. Anyway, we flew formation together. He didn't end up clacking into me. We got to the island. They wouldn't let us shoot a formation approach. They made him stay up on top. I went in and landed. It was a little lower than we thought. He decided instead of flying the approach, he was going to dive down to the water to where he could see the island visually and then fly in that way. He was really close to running into the water that night. He pulled up at the last second, kind of came in, flew in, landed, got out, and we stood there on the ramp, and that was the first leg of a 33-year ferry flying career, and that pretty much set the bar for the rest of my career because it seems like every single time I take a trip, something like that happens. So, yeah, exciting stuff. So a lot of people ask, basically their big question is, how can you fly small airplanes across the North Atlantic? I mean, they're not designed for that. Little trainers that they have out here at Menominee Airport, I will take one of those and fly to the other side of the planet. The biggest challenge you have to overcome is, number one, fuel. They don't have the gas to go to the seat. So what we do is we take the seats out of the plane, we put them in the back, and we put in great big metal fuel tanks, about the size of this table, about this high. And that's how we get the gas that'll give us the range to get across the North Atlantic. Because there's 3 different ways you can get across the North Atlantic. There's going down to the Azores, which is Santa Maria, or St. John's to Santa Maria, 1,800 miles, and Santa Maria to Portugal is 800 miles. You can do the northern route, which you go from Canada to Greenland to Iceland to Scotland. Each one of those legs are around 700 miles, 650, 700 miles. Or if you've got the range or the tailwinds, you can go straight across from Canada to either Ireland or Paris. That's a really long way because that's from St. John's to Paris is 2,400 miles, further than Honolulu to San Francisco. So we don't do that very often. When we put that much fuel in the plane, the FAA allows us to be 25% over its maximum normal load, which is a lot. Normally pilots will, they calculate every passenger down to the pound, and if you're 1 pound over, it's illegal. You can't fly that plane, not allowed. And they, take some stuff out, leave a couple pairs of socks at home or whatever, and we just blow that away, go 25% over that, and we never ever break that 25% barrier. Okay, all the time.
6
But
pounds.
we're not
a gallon.
supposed to. But you'd be surprised what these planes can haul. When you have a plane loaded like that, it's really sluggish and it takes a long time to get off the ground. But if you're really careful and baby it along, you can fly a plane that heavily loaded. The other thing that challenge we have when we put that much gas in the plane is the center of gravity. Planes need to be balanced. Can't have too much weight in the forward, in the nose or the tail. Usually the tail is what's really bad. And when we put the gas in there, we're usually battling aft CG, too much weight in the tail. We're allowed to be, and they measure it by inches, and we're allowed 2 inches aft of the normal limit. And again, we never break that. Yes, of course we do. Sometimes you just can't help it. That's what happens. You always know you've got a plane that's loaded too far back. If you set it, when the plane's all loaded and ready to go, if you put a coffee cup on the tail and the plane goes bong on the ground, it's like, yeah, that's a bit too much. But we fly it. Other challenges are, when I go to fly these planes, typically what's happened, or almost every time what's happened, is the plane's been sold. And that means when I show up, the seller has already got his money. And that means he's not going to teach me how to fly that plane. And he doesn't want anybody to do anything. He throws me the keys from across the parking lot, gets in his car, and he's a cloud of dust down the road. Because if anything happens to that plane while he's in charge of it, he has to give the money back. So I'm supposed to be the professional. It deal's all done. See you later. Bye. So I'll show up to fly these planes that not only have I've never flown before, often planes that I've never even heard of. And typically, pilots spend a lot of time with an instructor going through all the different systems and discrepancies and differences in how to fly this plane. But not a ferry pilot. I show up and I just have to get the manual on and look through it. I spend a lot of time looking through the manual, probably at least 5 minutes. And
Do you sign yourself off in your logbook on that then? Or how do
we
you
don't
do
need
that?
to sign off.
You don't? Oh.
When in the United States and different from most other countries, once you have a single engine commercial license, I can hop into any single engine airplane legally and fly, unless it gets over a certain weight or it's a jet. Same with multi-engine. Now, in every other country, every single different type of plane you fly, you have to get signed off by an instructor. That came into play once when I went to Egypt to pick up a Cessna 310, and if you're flying a foreign registered airplane in that country, you have to have a license for that country in that plane. And I did not have one. So I had to take a test. And then they asked, so I need to see your sign off for this particular type of plane. I did not have one, because even though I'd even owned one. So I literally had to call my pregnant wife back at home and have her forge a page of my diary where the instructor signed me off and fax it to the head of the Egyptian FAA. But now, typically when I'm checking myself out, I'll just flip to the page with how to start the engines, get her running, get it going as fast as possible down the runway. That usually works. Fast down the runway, I usually have 12,000 miles in which to figure out how to fly this airplane. So
Yeah.
usually I get it all figured out.
Find the trim knob.
Yeah. Other challenges we have in ferry flying are when you're flying long distances, like over the ocean or the jungle or the Sahara Desert, and there are not a lot of airports that you can go to in case something's wrong, you get to a point in your flight that is called the point of no return. Basically, when I take off over the North Atlantic, when I get so far, halfway or so, depending on the wind, if I go 1 foot past this line, point of no return, at that point, I do not have enough fuel to turn around and make it back to Canada. So once I cross that line, I am 100% committed to going to the Azores or wherever I'm going to. So before I cross that line, I have to make sure, how's the weather doing? How's the plane doing? Am I physically able to continue this 14-hour leg? Once you pass it, then you have to deal with whatever you come up against. If you get a line of thunderstorms, you got to weave your way through. Icing conditions, you get a bunch of ice on the wings, which can overload you and crash you into the ground. Change altitudes. Sometimes you have to fly really low over the ocean to get where the warm air is and melt the ice off your wings. Sometimes you have to fly so low that the salt spray from the ocean will help. That salt washing over the airplane will help melt the ice. That is an extreme emergency.
I guess so.
Really, really don't want to have to get to that point, but it happens. Because, the biggest thing that we're always concerned about is, let me get to that next. One last difference on ferry flying. Navigation, doesn't do you any good if the plane's running great and all this and you're feeling fine if you can't find where you're going. And like I said, when I first started, it was paper maps. We would go to Canada and they would give us this forecast for the Atlantic and a whole list of the winds aloft for everything literally from the South Pole to the North Pole, the entire Atlantic Ocean. And you would sit down with your map and you'd plot out a great circle course. And every 100 miles or so, you'd get the find a lat long, and you get your flight computer out and figure out what are the winds going to do at this altitude, what heading should I be on, and every 100 miles you change your course maybe a degree or two, and hope that you're right, because once you leave sight of land, you literally have no idea where you are. You're following a compass heading and you get your time, but there's nothing to cross-reference where you are. There's no islands or anything like that. So if you run into unexpected winds, like a really strong crosswind or a headwind, it can blow you miles off course or put you hours behind schedule. And you won't know that you're in trouble until it's too late. you're trying to pick up, you're waiting for your instrument to pick up the NDB at Santa Maria in the Azores, and it doesn't show up, and it doesn't show up, and it doesn't show up. And pretty soon you're in the water, and that's bad. Luckily, the Canadians are really good at forecasting winds aloft. I never had any significant problems before the GPS was invented, but I know a lot of pilots that came really close to ditching, and I know a couple that did and did not make it because is ferry flying dangerous? And the answer is yes, it is. Back in the 90s when I started, my first trip was 1990. We lost an average of 3 pilots over a year over the North Atlantic, and that's lost them. So it was definitely not a safe job. And that's why I took my survival really seriously. Now, when we're flying over the North Atlantic, I always wear a survival suit. It's basically like a big wetsuit. It's a 1/4-inch neoprene Gumby suit, basically. And that because if you ditch in the ocean, the water's so cold that you won't last more than a couple minutes if you don't have the survival suit on. Plus, we fly with a raft because even if you, you're not going to be able to see this very well. Even if you get out of the ocean in your survival suit, or get out of the plane in your survival suit, if you don't get in your raft, you're in trouble. So you can see in this picture here, I'm really sorry that this isn't with me. Got the big ferry tank there, and on top you can see the little orange thing there. That's my raft. Because once you're more than 100 miles out from the shore, you are going to be waiting for a boat. So you're beyond range of helicopter. There's no such thing as seaplanes anymore. So you might be in the water for a couple of days in your raft. So you really need to make sure that. Do you want another chair?
No, I'm good.
Okay. That hinges on the fact that you survive the ditching and get out of it, because ocean is not smooth. Ocean has huge waves, and you have to time it. You have to time your landing and just right, which might be difficult because the only reason you're going in is because your engine isn't working. So you got one shot at it, and if you hit the upslope of a wave, it's like driving into the side of a hill. You won't survive. Try to land parallel to the swells or on downhill. Then plane will probably flip over, start immediately sinking, and it'll probably happen at night. So you got to get out of there with your survival suit on and your raft. Get to the surface. Don't let go of the raft because it will blow away and you'll die. And get it inflated. Climb inside. Hit your rescue beacon and hope someone comes before you freeze to death. Awesome.
And that's never happened to you?
I have not ditched so far. I have over 100 ocean crossings in 33 years now, and so far, so good. But I've been really close a couple of times, which I'll tell you about. Other survival challenges that we have are if I'm taking a plane from St. Paul to Tanzania, I put my survival gear together depending on where I'm going to be flying over. But sometimes that can be difficult. Like from here, you fly over northern Canada, so you got to be ready for the northern Canadian wilderness. Then you're going to fly over some North Atlantic, heading to Greenland. Then I'm going to fly over the ice cap, so I need Arctic survival gear. Down through Europe, then I'll fly over the Sahara, I need desert survival gear. Get down into Central Africa, fly 1,800 miles across Central Africa where there's no outs. Then I need jungle survival gear. So I have to be prepared to land and survive in literally every climate or contingency in the world on one trip. That can be challenging. Other challenges that we have, probably the biggest challenge is the fatigue factor. Now, our job as a ferry pilot is to deliver these planes as quickly and cost effectively as possible. And that means flying alone. We never take another pilot with us, or almost never, because it's too expensive to pay him or feed him, hotels, landing fees, all that kind of stuff. So we're almost always flying alone. And a typical day of a ferry pilot is I'll get up around 4 o'clock, get out to the airport, try to get off the ground before sunrise, fly all day, which might be an easy day of only 8 hours. Typically, it's more like 10, 12. My longest solo leg is 14 and a half hours, which is a long time by yourself in a single-engine airplane or a small airplane. Fly all day. By the time you get to the airport where you're landing, you have to, most everything's shut down because you're going through multiple time zones. So you might have taken off at 5, but it's 10 o'clock at night when you get there. Go through customs, immigration, fuel up the plane. Excuse me. get it ready for the next morning, try to find a cab into town, find a hotel. Unlikely you're going to get anything to eat because it's too late, so bring along your snack bag. You always carry along a big bag of junk food, essentially. Spam keeps for a while. Spam and cheese whiz and sardines, stuff like that, crackers. Yeah, after a week of that, it gets kind of old. And then it's time to go to sleep. And good luck. You just got done flying, probably a hair-raising day of flying. You're literally still shaking from the adrenaline, and you're going to have to get up and do it again. So your mind is racing about what just happened and what's about to happen the next day. So you're laying in bed like this going, come on, I got 4 hours before I got to get up. It can be really hard to get to sleep. Luckily, super easy to get to sleep the next day in the airplane. Super. Which is the biggest challenge. After 4 or 5 days of flying, you begin to realize why they use sleep deprivation as a form of torture, because it can be just unbearable trying to stay awake. Especially, it usually hits me pretty good about 9 or 10 in the morning. You get that morning sun beating on you, drone in the airplane, just like
Micro sleeps.
Usually, pinch the inside of my thigh, do isometric exercises, anything to get the blood flowing. Listen to a lot of music, sing along with it, pound on the instrument panel, play a lot of air guitar. I got pretty good. It helps if you practice. Drink a lot of coffee and diet soda. That kind of helps with the caffeine. Of course, if you're going to drink a lot of liquids in a small plane, it's not your normal plane where you like go down the hall to the bathroom. So that can be one of the big challenges too. Where do you go? When I started flying, my boss used to tell me, the first thing you do when you come out there is get yourself a old milk jug or a windshield washer fluid jug or something. You can relieve yourself into that so you're not uncomfortable all day. Now, I never cared for that method because I hated at the end of the day, you've flown all day and now you're walking into the airport carrying your jug of apple juice. Kind of embarrassing. So I developed the Ziploc bagging method. Basically, relieve yourself into that, seal it up tight. Now you've got a nice little bag of waste. You can put it in your garbage bag, or you can just stick it under the seat if you want. If you do that, don't forget it's there, especially if you're flying down to the Amazon for a couple weeks. Trust me on that one. Also, always double bag the baggies. You trust me on that one too. And then if you're lucky enough to have a plane with a window you can open in flight, well, that's even better. You just open the window. There you go. No muss, no fuss. And often when I'm flying over the North Atlantic, I would save my pee bags for targets of opportunity. Ships. Now, I don't think I ever hit anybody from 10,000 feet up. But if I did, I'm really sorry. And we don't need to go into the gory details of what happens if that other horrible, horrible emergency arises in a small single-engine plane. Suffice it to say, it involves a really weird yoga pose and smells really bad. And if you ever have the opportunity to fly a small airplane over the North Atlantic, try and avoid the all-you-can-eat seafood buffet at the St. John's Radisson. Trust me on that one too. So yeah, these having this for a job gets really interesting, and a lot of stuff can happen. I was ferrying a brand new single-engine Bonanza from the factory in Wichita, Kansas, to Paris one year. And I've been flying all day from Bangor, Maine. I got to St. John's, planning on spending the night there, going to Santa Maria and the Azores the next morning. And when I checked the weather, got a preliminary weather report, I saw that the winds aloft from St. John's to Paris were smoking, just straight across the Atlantic. And I did some calculation and realized I could make it to Paris that night instead of going down to the Azores and up. I mean, I would save a full day of flying, save the company thousands of dollars in fuel, landing fees, hotel fees, taxi fees, and which is literally my job, is to get the plane there fast and cheap. I mean, so it was a no-brainer to just hop right back into the plane and continue flying that night without any sleep all the way to Paris. The fact that I was going to get a full extra day of partying in Paris had nothing to do with my decision to move on that night. I swear to God, it was purely professional. So I got in the plane, took off. About 4 hours into the flight, the wing tank gauges on the wing tanks were starting to bounce on E. It was time to turn on the ferry tank. So what you do is ferry tank's got a valve on it, and there's a pressure line that comes from the bottom of the plane into the top of the ferry tank, which I have to get out of order. Guys probably can't really see it here. Here's the plane I was flying over Africa. There's a black line that comes over the top. That pressurizes, puts air pressure in the fuel tanks, and that forces the fuel up to the wing tanks, where then the plane can use it. So when the wing tanks get a little low, I open the valve, let some of the fuel from the ferry tank into the wing tanks, turn it off when they're full, continue on my merry way. So I turned that on, went back to reading the book I was reading, probably a Tom Clancy novel or something that really thick, get me all the way across. And a little while later, I looked at the gauges on the wing tanks and noticed they hadn't moved. They hadn't gone up a bit. Well, that's not good. And jiggled the handle back and forth. Yeah, I got it right. And it suddenly dawned on me what kind of a predicament I was in. Because I didn't have enough fuel at that point to turn around and go back to Canada. Not even close. And I definitely had enough fuel to make it to Paris, or even Ireland. I had half hours left of fuel before my wing tank ran dry. And after that, I was going swimming. And like I always thought, odds of my survival probably 20%, maybe. So that was a big problem. Now, luckily, I have a unique ability to not panic in emergency situations. I've been in lots of them over the years, and what I do if I'm confronted with a problem like that is I can take that panic and normal human and I can set that aside. That's not going to do me any good right now, and I can focus on the task at hand. My saying is, if you've got time to panic, you've got time to do something more productive. I've been able to develop this just through putting myself in those situations again and again, which is not necessarily smart, but I didn't get the nickname Scary Kerry for no reason. I did that from a very young age, and just like learning anything, like a different language, skiing, whatever, the younger you start learning a skill, the better you are at it. And I started really young, climbing trees way too high, playing in the dam, the Coon Rapids Dam in the spillways with my buddy. Did a lot of really stupid stuff and got into a lot of trouble, but I can handle emergency situations better than your average person. Anyway, that night, I sat there and looked at that problem I had and like, what am I going to do? First of all, what's the problem? Why is it not flowing? Thought about the system in my head, and it's like, well, I messed with the valve, shook the plane around a little bit, opened the cap, see what I could see. Nothing worked. Then I had tools in the plane, disconnected that pressure line, and I should be getting a blast of cold Atlantic air blowing through there to help pressurize it, and it wasn't working. The pressure line was malfunctioning. Didn't matter why at that point. All I knew was I had a pretty good idea, but we don't need to go into that now, but it was basically not working. So I had to pressurize that tank somehow, or I was probably going to die. And I sat there and looked at that huge metal fuel tank. That line went, I guess if I could blow up an air mattress, maybe I could blow up a steel ferry tank. Stuck that line in my mouth and started blowing. Now, it didn't take long before the pressure built up because the ferry tank's full. There's only like this much airspace. Pressure built up, capped that line, waited a couple minutes, and lo and behold, the needles on the gauges twitched a little bit and moved upwards. Like, hallelujah, my Apollo 11 moment is over. I have solved the problem, and I might not die tonight. And then I looked at how much I moved and did some calculations and realized I'd only moved a couple of gallons. And I did some more calculations and realized I was going to have to blow into that hose all the way to Paris. And I had 8.5 hours left to go. Have you ever blown up an air mattress? It gets really, you want to stop after about a minute, maybe two. But after that, you're pretty much done blowing into the air mattress and take a break and go get back to it in a couple minutes. Yeah, I had 8.5 hours of that looking at me. And there wasn't anything to do but get started. I just stuck that hose in my mouth and started blowing. Now, immediately, a couple of problems presented themselves. number one, my nostrils and my throat were immediately trashed because the air at 15,000 feet, and I was up at 15,000 feet,
That's cool.
is cold and super dry. And it was basically like, and just once everything dried out, it was pure torture. It was horrible. Second thing was, I was at 15,000 feet and I had to stay up there because that's where those strong winds aloft were. Even if my ferry tank was working good, I had to stay way up there. The air's really thin up there. The oxygen is very hard to come by. And I didn't have portable pilot's oxygen with me, which I should have, but we can't because we can't bring it back on the airlines. And so I was immediately hypoxic. Now, normally I've got a very good high altitude tolerance. I fly a lot, I skydive a lot. That's where I live. And so just like people that live in Nepal, you get acclimated to high altitude. But when you're up at that altitude, I'm fine up to 18 to 20,000 feet as long as I'm sitting still, not exerting myself. This was the exact opposite of sitting still and not exerting myself. So I was immediately, like I said, hypoxic, or another term is stoned out of my mind. And I got really woozy. My concern at that point was if I passed out. Because if I passed out and stopped blowing in that line, the wing tanks would run dry, the engine would stop. That would probably wake me up. But once the engine stopped, and I would have to start immediately blowing into that line again. And I was pretty sure I wouldn't be able to pressurize that whole system, force fuel out to the wings, then into the fuel lines, then out to the engine, and get the engine running before I crashed into the ocean. So passing out was something that terrified me quite a bit that night. But I needn't have worried because I'm pretty sure I passed out at least 3 times.
Mhm.
I think. I'm not really sure because the whole night is really fuzzy. Luckily, along with the whole fatigue thing, is I developed over the years an ability to take really short cat naps, while flying. And you'd be amazed what a 30-second, 1 minute, or a couple of minute cat nap will do for someone who's in extreme fatigue. And I've somehow managed to figure out how to wake myself up from short cat naps. I'll wake up, go immediately into REM sleep, which is really weird. I'm actually dreaming before I'm 100% asleep. I'll get into that kind of half dream phase. Go into a huge REM sleep, dream, 30 seconds, minute later, wake up. What's going on with the plane? So I was able to utilize that night to not let the plane run out of fuel. Got to Ireland, called the approach there, hoping that I could land there, end that horrible night. No such luck. Heavy fog had drifted in. It was forecast. I was pretty sure it wasn't going to be good anyway. But heavy fog was closing all the airports down, and I was in no shape to shoot an emergency 0-0 run landing. Had to go all the way to Paris. Finally got to the point where I was over the English Channel and had enough fuel to make it to Paris so I could descend a little bit. Got down to 10,000 feet. Things kind of cleared up a little bit while I got into that thicker air and realized I could think clear. And at that point, I realized I should have descended even earlier when I knew I had enough gas to make it. But I needed to descend to think clear to realize that I should descend to think clear. Anyway, I didn't descend, so it took a while. Finally made it to Paris, shot a low approach, and that ended one of the longest nights of my life. So,
Got to ask you a question
Sure.
about that.
Yeah.
Does that plane have a window that open?
it did not.
Okay, that answers my question.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you could have just stuck the tube out the window.
Well, a lot of people ask that. Actually, the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association made a little movie about that incident on YouTube called Pressure Over the Atlantic. And it's a very accurate description. They even hired an actor to play young me in that, which is kind of funny. And then there is a window in the Bonanza that's right there. Why didn't you stick it out there? Because that's where the HF radio, we use HF radios to communicate over the North Atlantic. It's like a ham radio. And there's a big metal plate there because that's where the antenna ran through. So I couldn't do that. Other people ask me, why didn't I close all the vents except one and then tape that nozzle to one air vent and let that pressurize the tank? There's a really good reason I didn't do that, because I didn't think of it. 30 years later, someone pointed out, I'm like, well, that might have worked. But I didn't. But I have a million stories like that. I mean, the both books are completely full of those. The first one is all, it's my first 10 years as a full-time ferry pilot. And that's when it was the early days, and I really had just every chapter is just basically something like that. Then I took 10 years off when my kids were younger, and I realized I was pretty close to leaving them without a father, so I probably ought not to do that. And 10 years later, Discovery Channel came calling, sort of, and they were shooting a TV show about my job, and they wanted people to follow around. And I got a job on Dangerous Flights and started ferry flying again, and they chased me around the world for 2 years, filming every step of the way for that, which was
Cool.
even scarier than normal because the plane cockpit is completely filled with cameras. And if you do anything wrong, they don't cut it out to save your reputation. Just the opposite. They lead with that. Tonight on Dangerous Flights, Kerry makes a horrible mistake, and we're going to broadcast it to millions of people around the world.
Did we ever tell you about the plastic bag?
Slow motion. Oh, I did that. I did that on TV before. Watch this. Hold the controls. Yeah, and they always had us with another pilot, so we had something to argue with. But if you ever watch, you can watch both series of Dangerous Flights on YouTube now, both seasons. And two things. Number one, it's all real, except there's one part where I'm running out of gas in the Amazon. That was staged. It was our very first episode. And normally when you film a reality show, you gotta make mountains out of molehills because nothing really happens. So they over-dramatize everything, and they fake a lot of stuff. There's a show called Airplane Repo. If you've heard of it.
Yeah.
Bullshit from start to finish. It is all 100% staged and fake. I know that because I know a couple of guys on the show, but you can tell it's not real. Ours is real. But this one time, first trip, we're flying over the Amazon. They say, we need you to pretend you're running out of gas. I said, I don't want to do that because it makes me look like a moron. I have a reputation. I'm one of the most experienced ferry pilots in the world. This makes me look stupid. But they insisted, and I relented. But the rest of it is all true. They did over-dramatize things to make it exciting. Like, if they don't hurry, they'll have to land, dun, 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 at night. No, that's make us land, and they will surely perish. And they also told me when I started filming the show that, Kerry, the audience either has to love you or hate you. Just don't be boring. And I said, dibs on being a jerk. Way easier to be a jerk on TV than to be lovable all the time. So if you watch the show, I'm a little gruff sometimes. I did get my daughter Claire on one episode. Well, actually, a number of episodes. We flew together she was 18 at the time, from Uruguay all the way up through South America to the United States.
Nice.
And in one scene where she's taken off from Grenada, and beautiful, gorgeous day, and Grenada's fabulous, and she's flying, and I'm out the window taking pictures, and I look over, and she's flying with one hand, and she's taking pictures with her phone. And she's doing a good job, and I was kind of going, all right, way to go, Claire. And I went, oh, wait, TV show, I have the controls. Claire, how dare you do something so reckless as to fly with one hand and take pictures? But Dad, you do it all the time. So there's a lot of that in the show, but no, being a ferry pilot is, yes, the most adventurous job in the world. Somebody gives you the keys to a cool airplane, a handful of cash, says go have fun. But I've also been able to do some of the most incredible things in the world. I've got to buzz the Amazon first thing in the morning, twice. Great fun. Fly around the southern tip of Greenland, which is absolutely stunning. Let's see if I can get pictures of that. Basically, when you fly at the southern tip of Greenland, you see the ice cap oozing down into hundreds of glaciers, which break off into thousands of icebergs. The peaks of the southern tip are very sharp, like the Alps and the Andes, and it's magnificent. I get to fly around that and up and down the fjords and everything. I've got to fly over the grasslands of Africa, chasing wildebeest and onyx and all kinds of stuff across the ground. Yeah, I like flying low on other people's airplanes. One of the funnest things I ever got to do was delivering a plane to Anwar Sadat's son in Cairo. And I picked him up I flew the plane solo to Alexandria, which is right on the coast of the Mediterranean, and that's where the son got into his new plane, and he was very excited. And we were together. We flew to Cairo, and we got to Cairo, and he says, "Have you ever seen the pyramids?" I go, "No." Head that way, and sure enough, out of the dust and the mist, there are the pyramids of Egypt. We're like, wow. I mean, that's a dream come true for a pilot. You just see that. I mean, goosebumps. You know, it's like, I can't believe it. I'd seen pictures of planes flying, World War II fighters flying over the pyramids since I was a young boy. Like, I couldn't believe I was there. And then he looks over at me and says, "You want to buzz them?" I said, "Isn't that illegal?" Yeah. He goes, "Yeah, man, we're Saddam's son. What are they going to do?" I go, "Well, yeah, let's go buzz the pyramids." So, right down in between the pyramids, holy cow, there's the Sphinx. I didn't know the Sphinx was right next to the pyramids. We buzzed them 3 times.
Nobody got on the horn to you?
Oh, yeah, kind of low, as you can see by the picture. You might get close to that. I'm below the height of the pyramids. 3 times. We're both giggling like schoolgirls, just having a ball. After the 3rd time, we pull up, and he goes, "Okay, we better get out of here. Even I'm going to have some explaining to do tomorrow." Set the plane up for the airport in Cairo, the private airport, and it's sunk way down this hole. There's these huge apartment buildings surrounding it. And as I'm on final, I see there's all these dots in the air. And I'm looking, get closer. What the heck? Oh, there's kids on top of all the apartment buildings flying kites. Right in my way. I'm like, hey, I can get some kills here. Like, I better not. That'd be kind of mean. So I had to weave my way through the kites. And then I set up on the runway, and I look at it and go, "Hey, come on. There's a couple of 100 kids playing soccer on the runway." He goes, "I know, they'll move." And sure enough, just like kids in the United States are playing street hockey, we go car, they plane. But instead of scattering, they did this. I mean, literally not a foot, or give you a couple of feet of room. And as the plane's coming down, the kids would park just enough, and as the plane passed, they would fill right in behind you. And it was a dangest thing. Got the plane down. Having a mom smeared goat's blood all over the thing, which is another new thing for me. Then we sat on some lawn chairs, and as the sun set, it wasn't called a prayer, and you could hear the 15 million people in Cairo all praying at once. Wow. This kind of low murmuring, and as the sun's setting, it's orange, ruddy over everything. I'm like, I am not in Kansas anymore. That's some of the stuff I get to do as a ferry pilot. So
Sweet.
that is what I do.
Wow.
So,
that's cool.
Anybody have any questions?
Thank you.
What's the most dangerous weather you've ever had to contend with?
That's a toss-up because there's a lot of them. I got some really bad thunderstorms over Central Africa one night while I was lost. Another whole long story. I got into pretty serious icing over the Alps one day, and I was just cresting the peak and going to descend down to the Mediterranean, but climbing out of Zurich, I just picked up a ton of ice, and you're supposed to be like 19,000 feet to crest that last little peak, and I couldn't even make 19,000 feet. I had to cut some of the safety margin off, and it's in the clouds. You can't see the top of the Alps there, but you know that they're there. A lot of stuff like that. I got struck by lightning in a single engine plane over the North Atlantic one afternoon.
So you mentioned the North Atlantic is particularly dangerous.
Yeah.
I mean, because of the weather, or
Yep, because it's so cold.
Oh.
That's it. It's not only the ocean that's cold, but the land around it. Plus the clouds,
the storms.
The clouds up there are full of ice. That's what will get a lot of guys. You fly in clouds, like in the summertime here, you fly into the clouds, the plane just gets wet. In the wintertime, you fly in the clouds here, the plane starts accumulating ice. Now, some planes have de-icing systems that allow them to fly in clouds like that. When I got iced up over the Alps, the plane I was flying had systems to do that, but they were overloaded by the amount of ice that was flying in or was coming on the plane. But yeah, the North Atlantic is pretty bad. But even like northern Canada, it gets 40, 50 below up there, and you crash there, and if it's bad weather, they might not get you for 8, 10, 24 hours, and you'll be froze to death. So yeah, you always have to be ready to go down at a moment's notice. So my survival gear is very detailed for that. Anything else? Awesome. Well, again, apologies about the
That's okay.
that thing.
It's more fun hearing about it.
Thank you.
That was really interesting. Thank you so much.
And I made it through without passing out. I literally spent all 24 hours in the airliner. I had the greatest week. Well, we had to go flying in Namibia, and I actually gave this presentation 3 different times. And some people at this big fly-in that went almost 30 airplanes to this lodge in Namibia. They all gathered together. Every day we'd go out and fly around and fly low over the desert and the huge sand dunes and up the coast, Skeleton Coast, and everything. Unbelievable. So it was pretty cool. Had a good time.
Very nice.
Well,
Thank you.
Thank you.
You bet. My pleasure.